All right. Welcome. I'm Craig McHenry, Secretary of the Council of Competitive Intelligence Professionals Fellows, and welcome. Welcome to our webinar for May. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the monthly webinar with foresight strategist, expert Terry Thiele, entitled "Why Bother with Scenario Planning?" Have you ever wondered what the next chapter holds for you, or why the improbable all too often impacts the future? Well, Terry's going to look at those topics, and we'll do so just as he's been guiding the leaders across government, corporation, and academia to think beyond the present and towards what's on the horizon. His distinguished career spans across U.S. Treasury, the CIA, DIA, and Executive Office of the President. He has brought his expertise to Fortune 500 companies like GE, AB Electrolux, and Berkshire Hathaway's Lubrizol Corporation. A decorated veteran with 15 years in the U.S. Army Reserve, Terry understands the critical importance of strategic planning. He has since translated these skills into the realm of business and education, teaching strategy and innovation at universities and business school. And currently, he leverages his experience at Mercyhurst University's Department of Intelligence Studies. Terry's academic background is equally impressive. He holds a BA magna cum laude in history from Princeton University and a Juris Doctorate from NYU School of Law. He's also a graduate of the prestigious National War College. Terry's dedication to the field of intelligence was recognized in 2017 with the G2 Lifetime Achievement Award, and in 2022, he was further honored by being inducted into the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows. Extending far beyond his awards and accolades, he's also the author of a thought-provoking book, Our Fourth Age, a village elder's story for young Hemini sapiens about their future. Please share with me and Terry any questions that you may have using the Q&A tab on our webinar. And without further ado, let me welcome Terry to the call.
Well, thank you, Craig. Can you hear me okay?
Coming through perfectly.
Great. What I'd like to talk about today is three things. How do you cope with a rate of change that is accelerating? How do you get the most value out of intel collection? And how do you tame black swans? My agenda is going to go through 5 bits, looking at where we are, where we're going. How do you create a scenario? How do you apply scenarios? And how do you use them in the context of black swans? So let's first put some context around the issue. Well, how do you make money today? Take raw data, you analyze it, you turn it into intelligence. It's going from the fire hose to the teacup. You take that intelligence, you analyze it, and you arrive at insights. And with those insights, through analysis, you arrive at a business strategy. Now, the type of planning that you may undertake may involve a simple issue or event strategy, which is singular, usually time constrained. Think a spec setting exercise in an industry. What's the strategy for that? If you're at the global level, you may be encountering multiple issues and events, and how do you account for them all? Think if you're at a regional product level, you may have multiple regional issues that you have to account for. At a global product strategy level, you have to look at that over multiple regions. And at a business level, again, the complexification increases all the way to an entire corporate strategy where you've got to rack and stack multiple issues. Above and beyond that, you have to do competitor assessments and new business development. So there are a whole range of planning functions into which scenario planning can be applied. Well, what do you need to know? To do planning, I argue there are 3 types of intel you need. Competitive intelligence is about stakeholders, the individuals within your industry, what they're doing. Could be competitors, but could also be suppliers, anyone in your value chain. And the second tier is market intel. What's going on within your industry? In vehicles, think of vehicle electrification as an industry trend that has to be accounted for. And then finally, strategic intel, which is your classic pestle issues at the business environment level. Then the question is, at what time frame do you apply to that intel collection? Now, when you put it all together, it gets pretty complex. There's a lot of information that you have to collect. Now, what you're looking at here is an eye chart, but on the left side, it's basically inside the gate. It's talking about what your current business is doing. On the right side is outside the gate. What are those other stakeholders doing? And you have to collect it all if you're going to do rigorous strategic planning. The challenge, though, is not just getting that template filled for the business environment today. It's also figuring out what it's going to look like in the future. And of course, the starting point for a lot of this is your value chain, all of the different players within that chain, asking yourself, if for every dollar spent, how are the pennies allocated among the players? And then asking, what do competitors' value chains look like? So putting that all together today, finding where your competitors are strong and where they're weak, critical baselining. The challenge is, what does it look like tomorrow? And as we all know, value chains can be pretty complicated, and they evolve. Okay, so at the present time, we as a collective industry, if you will, of intelligence professionals, we're pretty good at looking at the gathering and analysis of information on mass production competitors. We're also pretty good at evaluating the maturity of business models for mass produced goods. And we're also pretty good at looking at business performance of not only our own business, but of our competitors. Now, what do businesses actually look like? Well, candidly, my experience is that everybody focuses on the stakeholder information. They'll evaluate the market, but not a whole lot of people spend a whole lot of time looking at the business environment. They focus on the next couple quarters because that's what the stock market rewards. Relatively few companies look out 5 years, and only a very few look out beyond that. Well, with that in mind, consider the following. The average lifespan of Fortune 500 companies has collapsed since 1935. The lifespan of all corporations has nearly halved over the past 30 years. And the number of public companies has nearly halved over the past 20 years. Begs the question, what is going on? I would argue the following. What used to be is looking at your business model maturation over time was something that you could readily forecast and anticipate. Unfortunately, the rate and degree of change are accelerating, and your business model matures at a much faster rate than heretofore was the case. I'd further argue that historically, what we would evaluate or address in terms of problems could be broken down into three categories. The 51% solution problem is the guy who's painting lines in your parking lot, the contract is for $200 and he's judgment proof to begin with. He's working out of his back of his pickup truck. How much time are you going to spend on that problem? That's a 51%er. You're going to spend minutes on that. At the other extreme are the 99 percenters. These are the problems that if you don't get right are going to kill your business. They are planet killers. And in between is where we spend most of our time. Those challenges and problems that have to be more right than wrong, or in terms of your answer, but you didn't have to dot every I and cross every T. Those are your planet killers, though. Now, the good news historically was that your inbox was filled with the 51 percenters. You just were deleting these. There were luckily very few of the 99 percenters. Potential cost of event was obvious. You had to get the planet killers right. And so the prevention cost was justified to address the 99 percenters and ignore the 51 percenters. That's what life used to be. Okay, here's what I argue is about to change. The number of events is shifting. The number of planet killers is increasing. And I'm not the only one saying this. This is Joseph Schumpeter's Zerstörung, creative destruction, and it is accelerating. Well, it begs the question, if that's the case, what's driving it? I'd argue we're on the cusp of a meta revolution that is going to fundamentally change everything. On the technology side, we are looking at a confluence of technological innovations that are all occurring at the same time, unlike anything our species has ever encountered. And without going into the gory detail, that's a whole nother lecture by itself. Let me just list these disruptive developments. Energy production, small fission, the emergence of fusion as energy sources, leading to clean, cheap, ubiquitous, off-grid energy, which we will have, I would argue, clearly within the next few years. 3D printing, nanotechnology, automation, a whole range of diverse new materials with new performance characteristics. The impact of the Internet of Things combined with big data and analytics and artificial intelligence. The impact of blockchain and cryptocurrency on transactions. Synthetic biology and digital factories. Each of these disruptive technologies by themselves is dramatic. What makes it particularly problematic is they are all happening at the same time. Now let's talk about societal disruptions. If you track the data, the UN population forecast through the end of the century, 95% of population growth through the end of the century is Africa, only Africa, which is hugely destabilizing. We're also witnessing chaotic urbanization in those countries. At the same time, most of the developed world, certainly China, is witnessing global population collapse. These are bringing on deflation, deglobalization, labor disruption, poverty, and political disruption. And again, they are all happening at the same time. So what's this leading to is, I would argue, a global economic model that is getting turned upside down and inside out. We are going from a world of few making many to a world of many making a few, which is going to have enormous dislocations for production and consumption, and leading inevitably to political unrest. At the same time, these demographic changes are going to destabilize just about everything. And again, in many countries already, population numbers are starting to drop. Once populations start to decline, they don't stop. Let me repeat that. Once populations start to drop, they don't stop. It begs the question, are we planning for this? Now, you may say, well, I don't see any of this going on. Well, I would argue it depends upon where you're looking. And as the sci-fi author William Gibson said, the future is already here. It's just not yet evenly distributed. So welcome to the next industrial revolution, where we are going from a world where demand exceeded to supply to a world where supply will exceed demand. We are going from global mass production back towards local custom production. The term of art that is currently being used is artisanal manufacturing. I'm not the only one saying this. And if you look at some of the examples, this is really fascinating. This Local Motors Group, founded in 2007, open collaboration, co-creation on vehicles, open source designs using multiple micro factories. This artisanal manufacturing revolution is going to change everything. And in fact, you'll see the term microfactory appearing more and more in terms of the ability to do local, customized production of products. It's fueling the Maker Faire group movement, and hopefully you've seen information about this crossing your media. It's our young people treating atoms like, I love treating atoms like bits, employing digital tools for design, digital means of collaboration, and factories for hire. So what does it mean? If we're going from dozens of millions, where we know how to evaluate the intel, to millions of dozens, where mass factories are replaced by local customized production, how do you gather the intel and analyze it for that sort of competitor? Think about measuring business performance. We know how to do that for dozens of millions. But what happens when we go from millions to millions of dozens, where we're no longer buying anything in China and everything is locally customized and produced at the street corner? Most of the economic measures of performance are obsolesced. I have a cautionary tale, and this is from a good 30 years ago when I worked for Electrolux. We had a cabinet company. Electrolux was pretty much a conglomerate at the time. And the question was, should we keep it? And so we did a market analysis, and this was what we saw as the competition for our cabinet company. But something seemed wrong, so I called in another expert and asked him to take a look at it. And we had forgotten Bubba. Bubba is the local guy. You see him on HGTV all the time. He's the custom cabinet manufacturer that lives locally, produces locally, customized cabinets. He's working out of his pickup truck, and all he needs is enough cash out of the deal to buy another keg of nails and a 6-pack of beer. Bubba doesn't know anything about an ROI. It is really tough to compete against Bubba. Okay, this is local custom production. As a result, Electrolux sold the cabinet company. Okay, so think about your value chains. We know how to look at them now, but what happens when we're in a world of millions of dozens and that competitor completely redefines the value chain? How are you going to figure this out? I'll give you two examples. I've got an app on my phone for M. Taylor. You put your cell phone on the floor, you stand there, and you turn around, and the cell phone camera will take your measurements, and the company can then do a bespoke suit. They have dozens of different suits and different materials that you can pick, 20% more accurate than a professional tailor. Or consider getting a customized shampoo. The point is, where business model maturities are accelerating. Think of it this way: using disruptive technology in the past was a nice to have. Going out into that white space, you could do it if you wanted, but it was kind of scary out there. It was okay to simply run the business and stay in the bottom left hand corner. You didn't necessarily have to reinvent the business. That's not the future. The future is one where change is coming after you. And in order to run the business, you are going to have to reinvent it before your competition does. Okay, so how do you model the future in the midst of all of that chaos? Yeah, it's a hard decision.
Terry, let me interrupt you there. That that's a great point to interject one of the questions that came from our audience. Rich asked, with so much change and volatility in the markets, how often should CA analysts be refreshing their competitive market assessments? Monthly, weekly, daily? How do you begin to spot some of these changes that you mentioned right in front of us?
Let me take that question in a bit.
Okay.
I'll hold on to it, but I'll
Yep.
put it in the context.
I will remind you later. Very good. Thank you,
Okay.
sir.
All right. It begs the question. Now what? Well, you still need to forecast. You'll see Major Oil, because they put a lot of investment in long-term infrastructure. Look out. These are the few that look out the 10 to 20 years. But forecasting is tough. And as Dilbert says, you basically have to hallucinate about the future and then pretend that it's useful. As Neil Bohr put it, it's exceedingly difficult to make predictions, particularly about the future. And we're not very good at it. When you think back to Major Oil 15 years ago, all they talked about was peak oil and how it was going to drop. Nobody at the time was talking about shale gas. At the business level, we've all seen hockey sticks. Well, this is from McKinsey. It's an actual company's set of strategy plans versus actual performance. Didn't do very well. International organizations don't do much better. This is the IMF forecasting global economic growth. Okay, so that brings us to scenario planning. Why scenario planning? Well, I would argue that it enables you to play the what if game. Here's the difference: strategic business planning assumes the ability to forecast the future, and then it focuses on planning around that, and it's driven by probable, not potential impact. Scenario planning, on the other hand, is driven by potential impact, not necessarily the probability of occurrence. So it forces you to think about things you wouldn't otherwise have thought about. There's a long, rich history in scenario planning. The military has done it forever. Uh, I want to say The Effect of Nuclear Weapons. I have this book and the little celluloid computer there to nuclear bomb effects computer. The purpose of that was to evaluate alternative impacts of alternative attacks and what the necessary responses would be. On the right hand side, you're seeing wargaming back in the 80s during the Cold War that we did, seeing how long we could delay the Soviets from getting from the Fulda Gap to Amsterdam. And it wasn't pretty. Again, Royal Dutch Shell is probably the poster child for this. They modeled the oil cartel before the oil crisis and were better positioned to weather the 73 oil crisis. And again, they're still doing it today. So you explore the four corners of what might happen. You force your managers to think about the unthinkable. You force your managers to think about the long term. Okay. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to predict the future correctly, and it certainly doesn't build your strategy for you. You still have to do that. But this is how you apply the intelligence that you have generated to a strategic planning process. It allows you to stress test your strategy against alternative futures. Methodology. First, identify the transformational themes. These are the things that are going to dominate your target timeline. You pick two that are most dominant. You envision the extremes of those themes. So, for example, when I was working for Lubrizol in engine oils, one of the transformational themes was engine oil drain interval. That was a big deal. Shorter drain interval, you sell more engine oil. Longer drain interval, you sell less engine oil. The two extremes were very short engine oil, 1,000-mile drain, and fill for life engine oil that you never change. Now, would either of those have ever occurred? No. But by taking the extremes, it forced you to think about the what ifs as the future would trend in one direction or the other. You take the extremes and you combine them, plus, 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 minus, 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 plus. Critical. They have to be plausible. Having spaceships landing on the mall is not a plausible scenario. By the same time, they have to be provocative, or they won't get your managers to think. Okay, you look at the four corners of the possible future landscape and you think about how your business is going to perform in each. And then you force rank what scares you most. You are now in a much better position to build a strategy. You have to forecast, but you're in a better position to think about the what ifs. Where this fits in your intel cycle is thinking about the mysteries of the future, what the forces will be that shape your environment going forward. That's what this helps you with. Bear in mind, depending upon the issue you're looking at, you could have three different parameters that impact your scenarios: the intensity of the change, the breadth of the change, and the duration of the change. So theoretically, if you want to complexify your analysis, you could come up with an 8-blocker. Challenges: distinguishing between predetermined elements and critical uncertainties. Predetermined elements are things that are going to occur. There's going to be an election in November. Critical uncertainties are the variables that you have to address. Who's going to win the election? So listing your critical uncertainties in order to find the two that are most problematic. Those are your transformational themes. Several challenges along the way. Getting the time frame right for your scenarios. Now, people think, oh, this has to be 20 years. It could be 15 minutes. I could scenario plan lunch. I used to do these in class on a chalkboard. Somebody would throw up a topic and we would build a scenario within 5 minutes. It's a mental exercise. Having the right people in the room. If you have people in the room for a scenario planning exercise that are unwilling to assume a future that is, in their mind, unrealistic, and they just sit there with their arms folded across their chest, you're not going to get anywhere. My experience has been that all too often with scenarios, people pick the best case scenario as their forecast and they run away from the worst case scenario. In truth, it might be somewhere in between, but you have to account for them all. And recognizing that in some companies that have historically been successful, they are less prone, less likely to think about future failure. They'll continue to do what had previously been successful as it drives them directly into a bridge abutment. What you're looking at here is a parking lot that used to be the global headquarters of Addressograph Moldograph, a Cleveland company that manufactured all of the hardware office equipment that offices required before there were computers. And recognizing in your process that you're in this for accuracy, not necessarily precision. A highly precise but highly inaccurate outcome isn't going to help your strategic planning. Also recognizing that building scenarios is in part an art form. You're telling stories. You're creating futures that have to be believable and compelling. And sudden change, and we'll get to that in a bit. All right, so how do you use it? Well, I'm going to give you a 9-step for your consideration. A couple definitions first. Givens are the things you can't change based on your strategy. If corporate headquarters says you are not allowed to put steel in the ground, that's a limitation on where your strategy is going. That's a given, it's a constraint on your plan. Issue drivers are what you have to address to be successful in a given scenario. 2 or 3 or 4 things that you've got to do correctly to succeed in that world. Operational objectives are what move your issue drivers. Tactical plans are what accomplish your operational objectives. Okay. First, where is your business today? Your baseline. Where are you on the Sly-Watsky value migration curve? You have to, and I'm doing this based on an analysis I did several years ago for the consulting industry, but you have to understand where you are on that curve. Secondly, what critical uncertainties are you facing? Now, I picked out for this example microeconomic business structure and macroeconomic industry structure. Those are the most disruptive, I said, for the consulting industry. Then you have to ask, okay, well, what do the societal disruptions do in terms of generating critical uncertainties? How do those disruptions lead to business effects, macroeconomic and microeconomic? And you do the same thing for technological disruption. Take those technologies and ask, what are the business effects? How does it impact manufacturing, sales, service offerings, communication, commerce? What are the changes that they'll lead to? Okay, then you build your industry scenarios. Here are my 4 scenarios for the consulting industry. The transformational themes were microeconomic business structure, macroeconomic industry structure, either for businesses, many small or a few big, or for industries, global markets, or local markets. And here are your 4 scenarios. Scenario 1, Goliath, global markets with a few big businesses. Scenario 2, global bazaar, global markets with many small businesses. So you see what we've done here. In this particular case, I also added elements of probability, likelihood of impact, likelihood of timing. So my forecast in these scenarios was global bazaar. Town bully, however, was most impactful. Farmers market, however, was the first to arrive, but this was most probable. Okay, what issues drive each scenario? Well, you need to address the issue drivers in order to succeed. And in this case, the issue drivers I picked for global bazaar were communication and marketing. Okay, and again, this is just an example. It's a high level, but to give you a sense of, I've got to deliver communication and marketing if I'm going to be successful as a consultant in global bazaar, a world of global markets with many small players. What's your competitor assessment? Well, you have to take a look at your stakeholders and ask, how are they likely to respond to each of those scenarios? What is your principal competitor going to do in order to survive in global bazaar versus what you're going to do? And then what do you have to do to affect that issue driver, to move it in your direction? These are your operational objectives. Now, what I picked for communication, my first issue driver, was I had 3 operational objectives. I needed video conferencing, I needed work production technology, and I need shared office facilities. But I also took the time to look at the worst case, most impactful scenario, town bully. And there my issue drivers were communication and bandwidth. And for bandwidth, I needed to get student backroom resourcing and competitor referral collaboration capabilities. Those were my operations. In order to succeed, that's what I needed to do. Now notice, in these 2 scenarios, they shared an issue driver. That's important, and we'll talk to that in a bit. Okay, what are my operational objective OTSWAs? What is an OTSWA? I would argue that an OTSWA is a SWOT analysis done properly. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the question first, outside the gate, is a given operational objective an opportunity, or I should say a given issue driver, an opportunity or a threat? And I'm going to rank it. Now you'll see these bars, either green or red, 3 blockers on either side. This was simply a visual to get your business team to have a controlled argument. Is the importance of that operational objective a 1, a 2, or a 3? Okay, it's an arbitrary, but it forces them to have an argument. Okay, I've now looked at whether it's an opportunity or a threat outside the gate. I now come inside the gate and I ask the question, today, am I strong or weak to deliver on that operational objective? And you can see the outcome on the lower half of the screen. And so here, playing that out for the operational objectives I picked, put some coloring in. Now, what's the most important thing about this chart? What's the most important thing about this chart are the explanations as to why your team made the choices they made about how important the factors were. It's the text, not necessarily the bars. And this is an example. I know it's an eye chart, but it gives you a sense that actually came out of a strategic planning session of the opportunities, threats, strengths, weaknesses for the different operational objectives. And what was important was the why. And that was the part capturing that, the team argument over why they chose the ratings they did. Okay, prioritization. The nice thing is you take those and you can rack and stack them. Okay, issue drivers for 1A, opportunities, threats, and you take it all together. Well, what do you do with that? Well, here's an example from a planning session I did with a lot of operational objectives for different issue drivers. And by taking the opportunities and threats, the numbered bars that we had for each issue drivers, I could come up with a gross score, the need of opportunity and threats. So you see the 5s, the 4s, the 3s, the 2s, the 1s. This gives me a very rough, broad way of prioritizing what to work on because you can't do everything all at once. Okay, and then the tactical action plan. Who needs to do what by when with what resources to deliver a given operational objective? Okay, this is a Gantt chart. If you don't do this, everything else you've done is a waste of time. Okay, well, what happens normally with your strategic planning documents and all this work that you've done? Well, this is normally what happens to it all. So if you're not doing constant monitoring, if you're not doing periodic reassessments, and if you don't adapt to change, then it's a waste of time. There's just because you did a scenario once doesn't mean that it's the right scenarios. Revisiting them is an ongoing exercise.
Terry,
Oh,
let me interject here because this is a perfect time to ask you a question that came in from Talk. Assuming that this impact and timing and probability part of the exercise is team-based, are there
mhm.
tips with how to come up with them or how you kind of drive the team to actually come to a decision?
Well, it's the facilitator's challenge.
Yeah,
This is where facilitate, and I think a lot of that comes down to having the right people in the room.
yeah,
So when you're doing an exercise like this, I have always shot for a team of 6 to 8 people. If you look at the analysis of how humans behave, humans build groups. They're intimate groups of around 6 to 8 people.
yeah.
Any more than that, and you'll have outliers that aren't participating. I think genetically 6 to 8 people was the number of people it took to bring down a woolly mammoth. Okay, and so we're hardwired to work in groups of that size. So having the right 6 to 8 people in the room is absolutely critical, and representing your tech side, your sales side, your finance side, all of that. They've got to be present, and they've got to be the right people.
So
Um,
would you recommend not having that senior level exec who
no,
might
absolutely not.
yeah,
Absolutely not.
yeah,
This the vice president commissions it, and you report out to the vice president, but you don't have the vice president because everybody looks
yeah.
to see the vice president's body language. Okay. I would have this the worker bees that are going to have to carry it out because they're the ones that will have to come out, deliver the analysis, and say this is what we've signed up to do.
Great. Last question. In the farmers market example or part of the example, in that scenario, that's just a year out. I mean, if you
Yeah.
wait too long, do you run the risk of actually things changing and you needing to redo this just to
Well,
be ready for this?
the timing of your scenarios is absolutely critical in terms of how far out you choose to look, uh, with the expectation, and it usually, I think, is driven in large part by your investment cycles.
Hmm.
What's your return on investment, you know, numbers that you've got to hit over a certain timeline that dictates a lot of this. But in this case, you're right. The farmers market now, in this particular case, this is, I'm going into the weeds a bit. This is a two-tailed scenario. What do I mean by that? The starting point is in the crosshairs in the center because it could go in either
Mhm.
direction, left or right, or up or down. You're starting there. So one could argue that this starts and then goes through farmers market to arrive at global bazaar along the way. Uh, you can have one-tailed scenarios, and I'll show you one at the end.
Correct.
Uh,
Let's get back to the black swans because that's a very engaging part of this whole business because we're trying to anticipate the changes. So please carry on.
right. And black swans, hopefully everyone is familiar with the term. And basically, what we're talking about is unanticipated discontinuous change. Now, arguably, you can anticipate an earthquake or a flood. You say, what if it were to happen? But people, this is classic risk management. People rarely pay much attention to them. You can use scenario planning as a tool to model a given black swan. The challenge is getting people to commit the resources to do it candidly, because they'll say, "Oh, that will never happen." I mean, Donald Trump simply isn't going to get elected. Hillary's going to be the next president. And so nobody took the time before Donald Trump was elected the first time to model what might be the government implications of a Trump White House. So that's the challenge with risk management. the point I would make with black swans, which is earthquakes rather than plate tectonics, is it immediately changes the environment, but that's the exact right point to do a scenario. Once that black swan hits, the first thing you should do is say, okay, what are the possible futures coming out of this discontinuous change? Because most black swans leave you, sort of, deer in the headlights. Scenario planning is a tool that then enables you to grapple with that uncertainty. That may not be enough of an answer for some people, but um, for me, that's the valuable part. Is it immediately gives me a tool to address the black swan. All right, now I'm going to quick. I've got 15 minutes left. Are there any questions at the moment that we need
No,
to catch up?
we've been able to catch up as we've gone. I'll continue to watch, but please take us through your example.
Okay. This was done a number of years ago by a trade association that I was working with to address a Department of Energy initiative around dealing with waste oil. Okay. And what was the appropriate response for dealing with used engine oil? We modeled the transport sector. The one transformational theme was urbanization. Was it going to be suburban or dense urban? And you can see, I'm not going to read all of this, but you can see a lot of detail went into these transformational extremes. The other transformational theme was technology impact, low or high. And again, you can see there's a lot of detail that we built into this. And on the right-hand column, you can see the impact it had from low impact and high impact on the energy production mix, renewables, non-renewables, fission. You put those together, and here were the 4 scenarios. Low technology impact in a dense, urban, rich, poor environment was Dismalville. Okay. And again, we were doing this for the Department of Energy, so there was a lot of drama that we wanted to build into the scenarios. Now, this is a one-tailed transformational theme in that technology can't get worse. So on the x-axis, you were starting on the left-hand side. On the urbanization axis was two-tailed, so we were at midpoint. So the starting point for this, arguably, is between Sprawlton and Dismalville. Well, we're not necessarily sitting in Dismalville, but the point is, you don't forget technology. You only add it. Okay, so we're starting with none, and then we go from there. So that was the question: where were things going to go in the future? Okay. Before we did anything else, we asked 3 questions. The first was, how do you move people in 2035? And you can see an analysis for developed cities and an analysis for developing cities. Okay, so you got that input there. And then you factored those into the 4 scenarios where they would fit. And you can see the changes in the pie charts based upon the scenarios. Second question, how do you move goods? You can see global movement on the left and how it played out, how goods would be moved in the 4 scenarios. A lot of detail, a lot of groundwork, spade work done behind the scenario building. Third question, what does manufacturing look like? Because manufacturing impacts transportation. Again, the manufacturing by type laid out globally on the left-hand side, and then how it played out in each of the scenarios. Now, what that led to is for Dismalville, here we're moving people, moving goods, and manufacturing type. This is a rich, poor, chaotic mega city in a balkanized trade world with little planning and disappointing technology. That's your scenario. And then we extrapolated from 2020, where we were, to what we thought it was going to look like in 2035. And you can see the pie chart movement. Okay, what did that lead to? Well, here's your scenario description. Those are your pie charts. Now, remember, we talked about how do you do strategic planning? You take your data, you do some analysis, and you generate intel. We've got the intel. And these were the implications for moving people, manufacturing, and moving goods. And you can see a lot of detail. Again, I'm not going to read it to you, but a lot of detail built into this as to what the implications of that would be. Okay. Now, what are the insights that you would draw from that world? Here are the insights when it came to lubricant implications. ICE is internal combustion engine, PC is passenger car, MC motorcycle. There's a lot of detail here. But what you can see that we extrapolated were the insights for lubricants at a very detailed level in 2035 for that scenario. Now, Transsectaria was high-tech, suburban middle class, global trade world, extensive planning, new tech readily available. Okay, here are our 2020 baselines. Here's what 2035 would look like in Transsectaria. Here's the scenario description. Again, a lot of detail, a lot of the pie charts. What's the intel that you can draw from that? Here's what the implications were. What's the insights you could draw from that? Here's what the lube implications could be that you could draw from that scenario. And again, we did the same thing for Sprawlton, and we did the same thing for Schizoidville. Now, I'm showing you the slides. This was in a document that had a lot of the background information that elaborated upon all of the bullets that you saw. One of the, I thought, most interesting takeaways is when you looked at all four scenarios. Theoretically, if you've done your scenarios right, you put a pin in that, somewhere within the four corners of your scenario is the future, and wherever you put the pin. Well, if all four scenarios have the same implications, you can take those to the bank. So there were a number of observations that we could pull out of the scenarios without necessarily looking at a forecast. And with that, I look and I've got 5
Perfect timing.
minutes. Any
Yes,
questions?
we do. So, thinking back to the Black Swan event, when you think about especially a natural disaster where they assume you need 3 days just to figure out what's what and how things fit back together, is that something that you need to take account of in terms of regrouping and preparing to do more scenario planning and just that disruption?
Well, there's the ideal perfect, and then the real practical. Um, Getting scenario planning in a black swan environment is always tough. Certainly in risk management, scenario planning is an ideal tool for risk management. That's really what Royal Dutch Shell did before the oil crisis. They pulled out a black swan, which was the oil producing countries forming a cartel. Who would have thought that would happen? One could argue that was the quintessential black swan, and they chose to model it. The problem, the challenge, is convincing a business that it's worth the time and treasure to model from a risk management standpoint issues before they actually occur. You have to come and show the business that it's a planet killer, that if this should happen, we will surely die. And so we need to understand it before it happens. That's the persuasive piece that consultants and planners have to be adept at. Because if you can't convince management to allocate the time and the head count to sit in a room to do the work, to model a black swan before it occurs, then good luck. Modeling after it occurs, it's a lot easier to convince people we got to figure out what's going on here. You're in more of a crisis mode because all of a sudden something dramatic has changed. We had a classic black swan in India for one of our companies. The primary distributor on a just turned on a dime, and on Monday was our best friend, and on Tuesday had gone over to the competition, and we were left without the primary distributor. That immediately called for damage control, and while risk management was doing damage control, then doing some scenario planning about, okay, where could we go, what do we do? This is a brave new world. We certainly have a transformational theme here. So it depends on your persuasive skills, I guess.
Absolutely. But you mentioned quite a bit of data in your examples, and it's important to have the data. Is it something to take caution when you look back a year or more in terms of coming back with data and saying this is going to be relevant in the future? What are there advantages to taking the scenario and locking it in time, or do you need to update your information? This goes back to the question about
You
how.
have to always, well, I mean, based upon the type of data, if you know how many 5-year-olds you have today, I'm sorry, my phone is going crazy here. Um, you should have turned it off. I know. If you know how many 5-year-olds you have today, you know how many 10-year-olds you're going to have in 5 years. Okay, there's certain stuff that you can control. The others are all critical uncertainties, and those critical uncertainties you have to monitor and track. Now, how much monitoring and tracking you do is a function of how grave the implications are if you get it wrong. But for me, a lot of the transformational themes, you assume day one that it's going to be a certain way, and a year later, you've already discovered that it's changing. And so it requires, you take it and you put it on the shelf. It's a waste of time. You've got to monitor what you're doing over time. And
Yeah,
if
that
you see sufficient change, you have to go back and challenge your prior assumptions.
Yeah, during my time in pharmaceuticals, we didn't dust off our pestle or steep, whatever you want to call that, more than once a year because we could see what was changing and lock that down and said, let's plan based on that. You've presented a lot of really great information, and these all seem to be oriented or targeted towards very large entities and large businesses. Is there a sense in which the same type of planning process would be valuable at a much smaller
Yeah,
level?
any level, and I can't stress this enough. Scenario planning is a thought exercise. That last scenario set I showed you required a lot of pre-work, but you can do a scenario planning in the morning for something that's going to happen in the afternoon. If you've gotten your transformational themes, the two things that are most important for this issue, and you throw them out and you plot them together and you build for scenarios, you can play the what if game at a macro level. You don't need any decimal points. It can be a 5-minute exercise. It doesn't have to be a 6-month exercise, and it can be for small questions, any question, as well as really big ones. So how much resourcing you choose to apply to it is really just a function of how significant the problem is. Is this a 99 percenter or is it a 51 percenter? I can use scenario planning for both, It's just a question of how much I'm going to allocate in the way of resources.
Excellent. I'll ask you to advance to the next slide because I want to make sure to remind people that the next monthly CI Fellows webinar will be talking a little bit about the positioning to win. And so you'll see an announcement of that and the ability to register for that in the next few days. And it will be on Thursday, June 20th, same time, same place. And look forward to
Hey,
seeing
Matt,
you all
safe trip.
then. Yes. Thank you, Terry. This has been most engaging and so many different areas and different things that we can take into the CI field proper to both facilitate as well as really make this a useful process. So thank you again for your time today.
It was a pleasure.
All right. And with that, I will bid you all a good day and look forward to seeing you all next week or next month. Take care.